Picture the twilight forests surrounding the Great Lakes in the dead of winter. A freezing, heavy fog clings to the black pines. The only sound is the sharp crack of frost-brittle branches. An Iroquois war party, the absolute, undisputed apex predators of the 17th-century frontier, moves cautiously through the timber, tracking their quarry. They are confident. They have exterminated entire nations. They believe they are the masters of the woods. Suddenly, from the absolute darkness of the tree line, a blinding flash of musket fire erupts. Then another, and another. There are no screaming war cries. There is no glorious cinematic charge. There is simply a cold, methodical execution from the shadows. The Iroquois vanguard drops into the freezing mud, their chests shattered by heavy lead balls, entirely unable to see the men who are killing them. The Iroquois vanguard drops into the freezing mud. They had erased the Erie and the neutral nations from the map, absorbing their survivors to fuel an endless war machine. Their military blitzkrieg was considered an unavoidable, continent-spanning force of nature. But when the Iroquois turned their sights to the north and west, intent on securing a total monopoly over the Great Lakes, they slammed into an unforgiving, impenetrable wall. They marched into the freezing fog, expecting to find just another victim to liquidate and absorb. Instead, they collided with a nation that had weaponized its very existence, turning millions of acres of wilderness into a gargantuan, inescapable logistical trap. History is never what you think. To understand how an unstoppable empire is broken, you must first discard the misconception that the Ojibwe triumphed simply because they acquired European firearms. Other tribes had guns. The Susquehannocks bought cannons and built geometric fortresses. The Ojibwe did something far more devastating. They bought time, and they traded in the currency of geography. The homeland of the Ojibwe, stretching across the Laurentian Shield through modern-day Ontario, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, is not a traditional, navigable forest. It is a hostile, labyrinthine matrix of millions of interconnected lakes, bottomless bogs, known as muskeg, jagged granite outcroppings, and incredibly dense taiga. The Iroquois military doctrine was built on swift, aggressive mobility. They utilized the clear, deep river systems of New York to launch lightning-fast canoe raids, followed by overwhelming mass infantry assaults on the static, wooden palisades of their enemies. But in the flooded, freezing taiga of the Ojibwe, that doctrine completely fractured. The Ojibwe did not fight alone. They operated within an ironclad military and political syndicate known as the Council of Three Fires. This was not a loose, temporary tribal affiliation. It was a highly organized, functional division of labor designed for total systemic survival. The Ottawa, controlled the trade networks and diplomacy, acting as the merchant marines of the lakes. The Potawatomi managed the southern supply lines and agricultural backing. The Ojibwe served as the kinetic fist of the alliance, the heavy infantry of the north. When the Iroquois destroyed the Huron Confederacy in 1649, they eliminated France's primary trading partner. The French colonial economy in North America was immediately pushed to the brink of absolute bankruptcy. Warehouses in Montreal sat empty. The Ojibwe saw the vacuum and stepped directly into it, offering the desperate French a cold, pragmatic transaction. The Ojibwe would assume total responsibility for protecting the northern trade corridors and delivering the beaver pelts. In exchange, the French would provide them with direct, unrestricted access to muskets, powder, and lead, without the diplomatic haggling that usually accompanied European trade. It was the birth of a fiercely independent military-industrial alliance, fueled by French steel and anchored in the deepest swamps of the continent. In the 1650s and 1660s, the Iroquois attempted to force the issue. They dispatched massive, heavily armed columns of 500 to 800 elite warriors deep into the Great Lakes region. In the mathematics of 17th-century warfare, an 800-man column is a logistical nightmare. To keep 800 men fighting in freezing conditions, you need over 2 million calories a day. You cannot carry that much dried corn or pemmican on your back for 500 miles. An invading force must hunt and forage to survive. The Ojibwe understood this biological ledger perfectly. They refused to play by the rules of conventional warfare. They did not build large, static fortresses that the Iroquois could surround, besiege, and burn. Instead, they adopted a doctrine of dispersed, elastic defense. When an Iroquois column advanced, the Ojibwe simply dissolved into the Taiga. They allowed the invading army to penetrate incredibly deep into their territory, marching for weeks through the biting cold and the insect-choked swamps. As the Iroquois advanced, the Ojibwe systematically severed their supply lines. They executed a scorched earth retreat. They burned the natural forage, drove the deer and moose out of the valleys, and sank any abandoned canoes to prevent the enemy from using them. Once the Iroquois columns were exhausted, starving, and entirely isolated hundreds of miles from their own borders, the Ojibwe struck. They did not fight pitched battles. They engaged in a merciless campaign of attrition, bleeding the crippled Iroquois detachments, piecemeal in the dark. The definitive blueprint of this strategy, and the psychological turning point of the war, occurred in the late summer of 1662, at the Battle of Point Iroquois. A massive Iroquois war party, composed primarily of Mohawk and Oneida veterans, had pushed aggressively into Lake Superior. Believing they had successfully infiltrated the heart of Ojibwe territory and were safe from pursuit, they established a large, arrogant camp on a prominent cape overlooking Whitefish Bay. They lit massive fires, celebrated their spoils, and prepared to strike the nearby Ojibwe settlements at Sault Ste. Marie. They did not know that Ojibwe scouts had been shadowing them for days, calculating their perimeter down to the yard. The Ojibwe did not attack immediately. They waited for the environmental conditions to guarantee absolute annihilation. They waited for the cover of night and a torrential, blinding rainstorm. The rain served a dual, lethal purpose. First, it completely masked the sound of hundreds of warriors moving through the dense brush. Second, and more importantly, it neutralized the Iroquois' greatest weapon. In 1662, firearms relied on exposed flint and a pan of loose black powder to ignite the charge. In a torrential downpour, the powder turns to a useless black sludge. A musket becomes nothing more than a 10-pound wooden club. Under the cover of the storm, the Ojibwe, allied with local Odawa and Nipissing warriors, silently encircled the camp. They did not bring muskets. They brought heavy, ball-headed war clubs and steel French trade axes. When the signal was given, the slaughter was absolute. The Ojibwe descended on the sleeping camp, smashing skulls and severing spines before the Iroquois could even draw their knives. The close-quarters kinetic trauma was devastating. Those few who managed to escape the tree line and run for the water found their canoes had already been destroyed by Ojibwe advance teams. They were cut down in the surf. It was a total, systematic liquidation of the Iroquois vanguard. Not a single warrior was allowed to return to New York to report the failure. The defeat was so complete, and the loss of veteran fighters so psychologically devastating to the Confederacy, that the geography itself was permanently marked. To this day, the location is named Point Iroquois, a geographic tombstone marking the exact limit of their empire. By the 1680s, the ruthless attrition had bled the Iroquois dry. The Ojibwe, now armed with thousands of French muskets and hardened by decades of total war, completely seized the initiative. They transitioned from a defensive posture to a massive, continental counter-offensive. They began to methodically hunt the Iroquois, pushing them entirely out of the conquered territories of southern Ontario and the lower peninsula of Michigan. This was no longer a defense of their homeland. It was a highly organized, ballistic clearing operation. The Iroquois were forced to retreat back across the Niagara River, abandoning decades of bloody conquests. But the ballistic superiority of the Ojibwe triggered a massive, violent geopolitical domino effect that forever altered the history of North America. As the Ojibwe rapidly expanded their hunting grounds and secured their borders with French firepower, they began to exert crushing pressure on their western neighbors, specifically the Dakota Sioux. Before the late 17th century, the Sioux were not the nomadic, horse-riding masters of the Great Plains. They were a woodland people, living in the deep, ancient forests of central Minnesota, hunting deer on foot and harvesting wild rice from canoes. It was the aggressive, heavily armed expansion of the Ojibwe that forcefully evicted the Sioux from the timberline. The Ojibwe's sheer ballistic advantage in the deep woods forced the Sioux to retreat westward, pushing them out of the forests and onto the open, unforgiving expanse of the Great Plains. Consider the staggering magnitude of this chain reaction. Without the Ojibwe's victory in the Beaver Wars, the Sioux would never have been forced onto the plains. They would never have encountered the vast herds of bison or adopted the feral Spanish horses, the entire iconic image of the Plains Indian warrior. The very existence of leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, the battles of the Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee, was the direct, unintended consequence of the Ojibwe clearing their own borders with French lead. The Ojibwe literally redrew the ethnic, cultural, and military map of the American interior. By the turn of the 18th century, the staggering reality of the war had set in. The Iroquois Confederacy, once the most feared military apparatus on the continent, was completely exhausted. Their population had been decimated by constant warfare and disease. They had been bled from the south by the artillery of the Susquehannocks, and their northern ambitions had been violently, systematically dismantled by the Ojibwe and the Council of Three Fires. The Iroquois were forced to the negotiating table. In the summer of 1701, over 1,300 indigenous delegates from dozens of nations converged on the French colonial settlement of Montreal. It was the largest diplomatic gathering in the history of the continent. In the resulting Great Peace of Montreal, the Confederacy officially recognized their defeat in the Western Theater. They signed a treaty, committing to permanent neutrality, and legally abandoned all claims to the territories west of Detroit and north of Lake Ontario. The Ojibwe had not just defended their homes. They had forced a seemingly invincible empire to capitulate, securing their own status as the undisputed superpower of the Great Lakes. They effectively monopolized the largest freshwater system on the planet. We live in a culture that readily remembers the Iroquois and the Sioux, but the popular consciousness has largely forgotten the Ojibwe. Why? Because the Ojibwe played the smartest, most pragmatic game in the history of the frontier. They did not engage in suicidal, open-field collisions with European armies. They did not make themselves a static target for colonial cannons. Instead, they seamlessly integrated European industrial technology into their own brutal, natural landscape. The fortresses of the Susquehannocks proved that European engineering could temporarily hold back an empire, but the Ojibwe proved something far more dangerous: a profound mastery of geography, combined with ruthless logistics, caloric mathematics, and asymmetric warfare, possesses the power to break an empire entirely. They fought a war of pure, unadulterated endurance. And when the heavy, black smoke of the Beaver Wars finally dissipated, the Iroquois Confederacy, the supreme conquerors of the 17th century, were forced to sign a peace treaty, dictated by the very people they had once considered their prey.